Hello there, lovelies. Welcome back to another stream. For some reason, I am not able to connect to my own chat. That's brilliant. Thanks, Twitch. So I hope that you are all well on this Saturday. Hey, Owlball. See, I can see what shows up in the chat window in the editor, but the chat itself won't connect. And I'm not sure what to do about that. So I guess I will have to rely on Twitch being twitchy. Yep, that's it. I'll just have to rely on watching it in the dashboard on Twitch. Well, no, I can't do that because then I can't read the story. Well, shoot, that won't work, will it? Anyway, I hope that you are all well. I hope the sound of the air conditioner isn't too bothersome because I'm not turning it off. It's been hot here. It was 104 to 106 here today, which is like, I can't remember what it is in Celsius. Really hot, that's what it is. Really hot. I know, bastards can't give me a good stream. Bastards. Bastards they are. I wonder if it has to do with, I had to revalidate my, I had to generate a new security token for Streamlabs chatbot. I wonder if that's why I can't connect in OBS. I'm almost tempted, but I don't want to end the stream and restart it again. Decisions. Also, I turned the sound of the beach and the campfire down because when I re-listened to the other stream, it seemed like they were kind of drowning me out. So I hope that this is better. No, I'm glad you can't hear it. To me, I guess, I don't know. It sounds like it's whistling to me, but that could just be the sound that I'm hearing. So as long as the microphone doesn't pick it up, I'm fine. And if the microphone does pick it up, honestly, I'm fine. It is too hot to turn it off. So we have got actually just a little, we've got about 150 pages left of our Scarecrow of Oz story. I got my water so I can stay hydrated. I can do some drinking water ASMR while I'm here. Hopefully won't have to take too many pee breaks because I've been drinking a lot of water. But yeah, I know Europe has really been having a heat wave. I feel so sorry for those people in Paris. Like, that is just unreal. And it is going to bug me so much that I cannot connect to my own chat room. Yeah, it won't even let me send a message. I can't chat with you guys. Refresh chat. Maybe that will work. Okay, now I'm connected to the chat. 27 a few days ago. Yeah, it's... But global warming is a hoax. Remember that. Global warming isn't real. It's all in our heads. But yeah. I hate summer. I can deal with the cold better. Because, like, I can put more clothes on when it's cold. There's a limit to what I can take off and not be arrested. Global warming isn't real. Totally not real. We're totally not having weird weather waves or anything. This is fine. It's fine. It's all fine. It's all fine. I mean, I've got a cousin who lives in Huntington Beach, which is, I can speak, which is in Southern California. Like the beaches. I mean, literally right on the beach, and their high was 78 degrees Fahrenheit. Which is, it was 25 Celsius. It's like, how is this normal? How? It's not. But that's enough of me bitching about the weather. Because that's not why you're here. You're here because you want to hear the rest of the Wizard of Oz. And I will finish this story, damn it. So I think when we left off, Uncle Bill had been turned into a grasshopper? Or something like that? Let's see. They had reached the kingdom of Jinxland. And they met Trot, who was the gardener boy. You lost all your progress in Visage? Oh no. That's horrible. Yeah, it's always annoying when you can't save and you lose everything. We need to just give them a piece of our minds, tell them that is not acceptable. Bastards. I'm trying to find where I left off. Okay, I have found our place. So yeah, we've got about 130 pages left of this story. So, let us begin. And I might be repeating a chapter that I'd already read, because I'm not entirely sure, and I'd rather repeat a chapter than skip a chapter. Now I need more water. Have some drinking ASMR. Actually, you probably couldn't hear anything but the straw hitting the cup. Alrighty. The wooden-legged grasshopper. Now it so happened that Trot, from the window of her room, had witnessed the meeting of the lovers in the garden and had seen the king come and drag Gloria away. The little girl's heart went out in sympathy for the poor princess, who seemed to her to be one of the sweetest and loveliest young ladies she had ever seen. So she crept along the passages and from a hidden niche saw Gloria locked in her room. The key was still in the lock, so when the king had gone away, followed by Googly Goo, Trot stole up to the door, turned the key, and entered. The princess lay prone upon a couch, sobbing bitterly. Trot went up to her and smoothed her hair and tried to comfort her. "Don't cry," she said. "I've unlocked the door, so you can go away any time you want to." "It isn't that," sobbed the princess. "I am unhappy because they will not let me love Pon, the gardener's boy." "Well, never mind. Pon isn't any great shakes anyhow, seems to me," said Trot soothingly. "There are lots of other people you can love." Gloria rolled over on the couch and looked at the little girl reproachfully. "Pon has won my heart, and I can't help loving him," she explained. Then with sudden indignation she added, "But I'll never love Googly Goo. Never, as long as I live." "I should say not," replied Trot. "Pon may not be much good, but old Googly Goo is very, very bad. Hunt around, and I'm sure you'll find someone worth your love. You're very pretty, you know, and almost anyone ought to love you." "You don't understand, my dear," said Gloria, as she wiped the tears from her eyes with a dainty lace handkerchief bordered with pearls. When you are older, you will realize that a young lady cannot decide when she will love or choose the most worthy. Her heart alone decides for her, and whomever her heart selects, she must love, whether he amounts to much or not. Trot was a little puzzled by this speech, which seemed to her unreasonable. But she made no reply, and presently Gloria's grief softened, and she began to question the little girl about herself and her adventures. Trot told her how they had happened to come to Jinxland, and all about Cap'n Bill and the Orc and Pessum and the Bumpy Man. While they were thus conversing together, getting more and more friendly as they became better acquainted, in the council chamber the king and Googly Goo were talking with the Wicked Witch. This evil creature was old and ugly. She had lost one eye and wore a black patch over it, so the people of Jinxland had named her Blinky. Of course, witches are forbidden to exist in the land of Oz, but Jinxland was so far removed from the center of Ozma's dominions, and so absolutely cut off from it by the steep mountains and the bottomless gulf, that the laws of Oz were not obeyed very well in that country. So there were several witches in Jinxland who were the terror of the people, but King Cruel favored them and permitted them to exercise their evil sorcery. Blinky was the leader of all the other witches, and therefore the most hated and feared. The king used her witchcraft at times to assist him in carrying out his cruelties and revenge, but he was always obliged to pay Blinky large sums of money or heaps of precious jewels before she would undertake an enchantment. This made him hate the old woman almost as much as his subjects did, but today Lord Googly Goo had agreed to pay the witch's price, so the king greeted her with a gracious favor. "Can you destroy the love of Princess Gloria for the gardener's boy?" inquired his majesty. The Wicked Witch thought about it before she replied, "That's a hard question to answer. I can do lots of evil magic, but love is a stubborn thing to conquer. When you think you've killed it, it's liable to bob up again as strong as ever. I believe love and cats have 9 lives. In other words, killing love is a hard job, even for a skillful witch, but I believe I can do something that will answer your purpose just as well." "What is that?" asked the king. "I can freeze the girl's heart. I've got a special incantation for that. When Gloria's heart is thoroughly frozen, she can no longer love Pon." "Just the thing," exclaimed Googly Goo, and the king was likewise much pleased. They bargained a long time as to the price, but finally the old courtier agreed to pay the Wicked Witch's demands. It was arranged that they should take Gloria to Blinky's house the next day to have her heart frozen. Then King Cruel mentioned to the old hag the strangers who had that day arrived in Jinxland, and said to her, "I think the 2 children, the boy and the girl, are unable to harm me, but I have a suspicion that the wooden-legged man is a powerful wizard." The witch's face wore a troubled look when she heard this. "If you are right," she said, "this wizard might spell my incantation and interfere with me in other ways. So it will be best for me to meet this stranger at once and match my magic against his to decide which is the stronger." "All right," said the king. "Come with me and I will lead you to the man's room." Googly Goo did not accompany them, as he was obliged to go home and get the money and jewels he had promised to pay old Blinky. So the other 2 climbed several flights of stairs and went through many passages until they came to the room occupied by Cap'n Bill. The sailor man, finding his bed soft and inviting, and being tired with the adventures he had experienced, had decided to take a nap. When the Wicked Witch and the king softly opened his door and entered, Cap'n Bill was snoring with much vigor and did not hear them at all. Blinky approached the bed and with her one eye anxiously stared at the sleeping stranger. "Ah," she said in a soft whisper, "I believe you are right, King Cruel. The man looks to me like a very powerful wizard. But by good luck I have caught him asleep, so I shall transform him before he wakes up, giving him such a form that he will be unable to oppose me." "Careful," cautioned the king, also speaking low. "If he discovers what you are doing, he may destroy you. and that would annoy me because I need you to attend to Gloria." But the Wicked Witch realized as well as he did that she must be careful. She carried over her arm a black bag, from which she now drew several packets carefully wrapped in paper. 3 of these she selected, replacing the others in the bag. 2 of the packets she mixed together, and then she cautiously opened the 3rd. "Better stand back, Your Majesty," she advised, "for if this powder falls on you, you might be transformed yourself." The king hastily retreated to the end of the room. As Blinky mixed the 3rd powder with the others, she waved her hands over it, mumbled a few words, and then backed away as quickly as she could. Cap'n Bill was slumbering peacefully, all unconscious of what was going on. Puff! A great cloud of smoke rolled over the bed and completely hid him from view. When the smoke rolled away, both Blinky and the king saw that the body of the stranger had quite disappeared, while in his place, crouching in the middle of the bed, was a little gray grasshopper. One curious thing about this grasshopper was that the last joint of its left leg was made of wood. Another curious thing, considering it was a grasshopper, was that it began talking, crying out in a tiny but sharp voice.
"Here, you people. What do you mean by treating me so? Put me back where I belong at once, or you'll be sorry."
The cruel king turned pale at hearing the grasshopper's threats, but the Wicked Witch merely laughed in derision. Then she raised her stick and aimed a vicious blow at the grasshopper, but before the stick struck the bed, the tiny hopper made a marvelous jump. Marvelous indeed when we consider that it had a wooden leg. It rose in the air and sailed across the room and passed right through the open window, where it disappeared from their view. "Good," shouted the king. "We are well rid of this desperate wizard." And then they both laughed heartily at the success of the incantation and went away to complete their horrid plans. After Trot had visited a time with Princess Gloria, the little girl went to Button-Bright's room but did not find him there. Then she went to Cap'n Bill's room, but he was not there because the witch and the king had been there before her. So she made her way downstairs and questioned the servants. They said that they had seen the little boy go out into the garden some time ago, but the old man with the wooden leg had not been seen at all. Therefore, Trot, not knowing what else to do, rambled through the great gardens, seeking for Button-Bright or Cap'n Bill and not finding either of them. This part of the garden, which lay before the castle, was not walled in, but extended to the roadway, and the paths were open to the edge of the forest. So, after 2 hours of vain search for her friends, the little girl returned to the castle. But at the doorway, a soldier stopped her. "I live here," said Trot, "so it's all right to let me in. The king has given me a room." "Well, he has taken it back again," was the soldier's reply. "His Majesty's orders are to turn you away if you attempt to enter. I am also ordered to forbid the boy, your companion, to again enter the castles." "How about Cap'n Bill?" she inquired. "Why, it seems he has mysteriously disappeared," replied the soldier, shaking his head ominously. "Where he has gone to, I can't make out, but I can assure you he is no longer in this castle. I'm sorry, little girl, to disappoint you. Don't blame me. I must obey my master's orders." Now, all her life Trot had been accustomed to depend on Cap'n Bill, so when this good friend was suddenly taken from her, she felt very miserable and forlorn indeed. She was brave enough not to cry before the soldier, or even to She was brave enough not to cry before the soldier, or even to let him see her grief and anxiety. But after she was turned away from the castle, she sought a quiet bench in the garden and for a time sobbed as if her heart would break. It was Button-Bright who found her at last, just as the sun had set and the shades of evening were falling. He also had been turned away from the king's castle when he had tried to enter it, and in the park he came across Trot. "Never mind," said the boy. "We can find a place to sleep." "I want Cap'n Bill," wailed the girl. "Well, so do I," was the reply. "But we haven't got him." "Where do you suppose he is, Trot?" "I don't suppose anything. He's gone, and that's all I know about it." Button-Bright sat on the bench beside her and thrust his hands in the pockets of his knickerbockers. Then he reflected somewhat gravely for him. "Cap'n Bill isn't around here," he said, letting his eyes wander over the dim garden. "So we must go somewhere else if we want to find him. Besides, it's fast getting dark, and if we want to find a place to sleep, we must get busy while we can see where we're to go." He rose from the bench as he said this, and Trot also jumped up, drying her eyes on her apron. Then she walked beside him out of the grounds of the king's castle. They did not go by the main path, but passed through an opening in a hedge and found themselves in a small but well-worn roadway. Following this for some distance along a winding way, they came upon no house or building that would afford them refuge for the night. It became so dark that they could scarcely see their way, and finally Trot stopped and suggested that they camp under a tree. "All right," said Button-Bright. "I've often found that leaves make a good warm blanket, but look there, Trot. Isn't that a light flashing over yonder?" "It certainly is, Button-Bright. Let's go over and see if it's a house. Whoever lives there couldn't treat us worse than the king did." To reach the light, they had to leave the road, so they stumbled over hillocks and brushwood, hand in hand, keeping the tiny speck of light always in sight. They were rather forlorn little waifs, outcast in a strange country and forsaken by their only friend and guardian, Captain Bill. So they were very glad when finally they reached a small cottage and, looking in through one window, saw Pon, the gardener's boy, sitting by a fire of twigs. As Trot opened the door and walked boldly in, Pon sprang up to greet them. They told him of Captain Bill's disappearance and how they had been turned out of the king's castle. As they finished the story, Pon shook his head sadly. "King Cruel is plotting mischief, I fear," said he. "For today he sent for old Blinky, the wicked witch, and with my own eyes I saw her come from the castle and hobble away towards her hut. She had been with the king and Googly Goo, and I was afraid they were going to work some enchantment on Gloria so she could no longer love me. But perhaps the witch was only called to the castle to enchant your friend, Captain Bill." "Could she do that?" asked Trot, horrified by the suggestion. "I suppose so, for old Blinky can do a lot of wicked magical things." "What sort of an enchantment could she put on Captain Bill?" "I don't know, but he has disappeared, so I'm pretty certain she has done something dreadful to him. But don't worry. If it has happened, it can't be helped, and if it hasn't happened, we may well be able to find him in the morning." With this, Pon went to the cupboard and brought food for them. Trot was far too worried to eat, but Button-Bright made a good supper from the simple food and then lay down before the fire and went to sleep. The little girl and the gardener's boy, however, sat for a long time staring into the fire, busy with their thoughts. But at last Trot, too, became sleepy, and Pon gently covered her with the one blanket he possessed. Then he threw more wood on the fire and laid himself down before it, next to Button-Bright. Soon all three were fast asleep. They were in a good deal of trouble, but they were young, and sleep was good for them, because for a time it made them forget. "Hello, King Mob. How are you? It has been a long time. I hope that you're doing well." And I definitely read that part before, so we got a repeat of 2 chapters. I'm glad you're doing great. Chapter 13. Glinda the Good and the Scarecrow of Oz. That country south of the Emerald City in the land of Oz is known as the Quadling Country, and in the most southernmost part of it stands a splendid palace in which lives Glinda the Good. Glinda is the royal sorceress of Oz. She has wonderful magical powers and uses them only to benefit the subjects of Ozma's kingdom. Even the famous Wizard of Oz pays tribute to her, for Glinda taught him all the real magic he knows, and she is his superior of all sorts of sorcery. Everyone loves Glinda, from the dainty and exquisite ruler Ozma down to the humblest inhabitants of Oz, for she is always kindly and helpful and willing to listen to their troubles, however busy she may be. No one knows her age, but all can see how beautiful and stately she is. Her hair is like red gold and finer than the finest silken strands. Her eyes are blue as the sky and always frank and smiling. Her cheeks are the envy of peach blows, and her mouth is enticing as a rosebud. Glinda is tall and wears splendid gowns that trail behind her as she walks. She wears no jewels, for her beauty would shame them. For attendants, Glinda has 100 of the loveliest girls in Oz. They are gathered from all over Oz, from among the Winkies, the Munchkins, the Gilkins, and the Quadlings, as well as from Ozma's magnificent Emerald City. and it is considered a great favor to be allowed to serve the royal sorceress. Among the many wonderful things in Glinda's palace is the Great Book of Records. In this book is inscribed everything that takes place in all the world, just the instant it happens, so that by referring to its pages, Glinda knows what is taking place far and near in every country that exists. In this way, she learns when and where she can help any in distress or danger, and although her duties are confined to assisting those who inhabit the land of Oz, she is always interested in what takes place in the unprotected outside world. So it was that on a certain evening, Glinda sat in her library, surrounded by a bevy of her maids who were engaged in spinning, weaving, and embroidery, when an attendant announced the arrival at the palace of the Scarecrow. This personage was one of the most famous and popular in all the land of Oz. His body was merely a suit of munchkin clothes stuffed with straw, but his head was a round sack filled with bran, with which the Wizard of Oz had mixed some magic brains of a very superior sort. The eyes, nose, and mouth of the Scarecrow were painted upon the front of the sack, as were his ears, and since this quaint being had been endowed with life, the expression of his face was very interesting, if somewhat comical. The Scarecrow was good all through, even to his brains, and while he was naturally awkward in his movements and lacked the neat symmetry of other people, his disposition was so kind and considerate that he was so obliging and honest that all who knew and loved him, and there were few people in Oz who had not met our Scarecrow and made his acquaintance. He lived part of the time in Ozma's palace at the Emerald City, part of the time in his own corn-hop castle in the Winkie Country, and part of the time he traveled over all Oz, visiting with people and playing with the children whom he dearly loved. It was on one of his wandering journeys that the Scarecrow had arrived at Glinda's palace, and the sorceress at once made him welcome. As he sat beside her, talking of his adventures, he asked, "What's new in the way of news?" Glinda opened her Great Book of Records and read some of the last pages. "Here's an item quite curious and interesting," she announced, an accent of surprise in her voice. "3 people from the big outside world have arrived in Jinxland." "Where's Jinxland?" inquired the Scarecrow. "Very near here, a little to the east of us," she said. "In fact, Jinxland is a little slice taken off the Quadling country, but separated from it by a range of high mountains, at the foot of which lies a wide, deep gulf that is supposed to be impassable." "Then Jinxland is really a part of the land of Oz," said he. "Yes," returned Glinda, "but Oz people know nothing of it except what is recorded here in my book." "What does the book say about it?" asked the Scarecrow. "It is ruled by a wicked man called King Cruel, although he has no right to the title. Most of the people are good, but they're very timid and live in constant fear of their fierce leader. There are also several wicked witches who keep the inhabitants of Jinxland in a state of terror." "Do those witches have any magical powers?" inquired the Scarecrow. "Yes, they seem to understand witchcraft in its most evil form, for one of them has just transformed a respectable and honest old sailor, one of the strangers who arrived there, into a grasshopper. This same witch, Blinky by name, is also planning to freeze the heart of a beautiful Jinxland girl named Princess Gloria." "Why, that's a dreadful thing to do," exclaimed the Scarecrow. Glinda's face was very grave. She read in her book how Trot and Button-Bright were turned out of the king's castle, and how they found refuge in the hut of Pond, the gardener's boy. "I'm afraid those helpless earth people will endure much suffering in Jinxland, even if the wicked king and the witches permit them to live," said the good sorceress thoughtfully. "I wish I might help them." "Can I do anything?" asked the Scarecrow anxiously. "If so, tell me what to do and I'll do it." For a few moments Glinda did not reply, but sat musing over the records. Then she said, "I am going to send you to Jinxland to protect Trot and Button-Bright and Captain Bill." "All right," answered the Scarecrow in a cheerful voice. "I know Button-Bright already, for he has been to the Land of Oz before. You remember he went away from the Land of Oz in one of our wizard's big bubbles." "Yes," said Glinda, "I remember that." Then she carefully instructed the Scarecrow what to do, and gave him certain magical things which he placed in the pockets of his ragged munchkin coat. "As you have no need of sleep," said she, "you may as well start at once." "The night is the same as day to me," he replied, "except that I cannot see my way so well in the dark." I will furnish a light to guide you, promised the sorceress. So the Scarecrow bade her goodbye and at once started on his journey. By morning, he'd reached the mountains that separated the Quadling country from Jinxland. The sides of these mountains were too steep to climb, but the Scarecrow took a small rope from his pocket and tossed one end upward into the air. The rope unwound itself for hundreds of feet until it caught upon a peak of rock at the very top of a mountain, for it was a magic rope furnished by Glinda. The Scarecrow climbed the rope and, after pulling it up, let it down on the other side of the mountain range. When he descended the rope on the side, he found himself in Jinxland, but at his feet yawned the Great Gulf, which must be crossed before he could proceed any further. The Scarecrow knelt down and examined the ground carefully, and in a moment he discovered a fuzzy brown spider that had rolled itself into a ball. So he took 2 tiny pills from his pocket and laid them beside the spider, which unrolled itself and quickly ate up the pills. Then the Scarecrow said in a voice of command, "Spin!" and the spider obeyed instantly. In a few moments, the little creature had spun 2 slender but strong strands that reached way across the gulf, one being 5 or 6 feet above the other. When these were completed, the Scarecrow started across the tiny bridge, walking upon one strand as a person walks upon a rope, and holding to the upper strand with his hands to prevent him from losing his balance and toppling over into the gulf. The tiny threads held him safely, thanks to the strength given them by the magic pills. Presently he was safe across and standing on the plains of Jinxland. Far away he could see the towers of the king's castle, and towards this he at once began to walk. I'm glad you swung by and showed me some love. It's always appreciated. Always glad to see my friends here. Chapter 14. The Frozen Heart. Wait, we need some more water first. Okay, now we are ready. In the hut of Pon, the gardener's boy, Button-Bright was the first to awaken in the morning. Leaving his companions still asleep, he went out into the fresh morning air and saw some blackberries growing on bushes in a field not far away. Going to the bushes, he found the berries ripe and sweet, so he began eating them. More bushes were scattered over the fields, so the boy wandered on, from bush to bush, without paying any heed to where he was wandering. Then a butterfly fluttered by. He gave chase to it and followed it a long way. When finally he paused to look around him, Button-Bright could see no sign of Pon's house, nor had he the slightest idea in which direction it lay. "Well, I'm lost again," he remarked to himself. "But never mind, I've been lost lots of times. Someone is sure to find me." Trot was a little worried about Button-Bright when she awoke and found him gone. Knowing how careless he was, she believed that he had strayed away, but felt that he would come back in time, because he had a habit of not staying lost. Pon got the little girl some food for her breakfast, and then together they went out of the hut and stood in the sunshine. Pon's house was some distance off the road, but they could see it from where they stood, and both gave a start of surprise when they discovered 2 soldiers walking along the roadway and escorting Princess Gloria between them. The poor girl had her hands bound together to prevent her from struggling, and the soldiers rudely dragged her forward when her steps seemed to lag. Behind this group came King Cruel, wearing his jeweled crown and swinging in his hand a slender golden staff with a ball of clustered gems at one end. "Where are they going?" asked Trot. "To the house of the Wicked Witch, I fear," Pon replied. "Come, let us follow them, for I am sure they intend to harm my dear Gloria." "Won't they see us?" she asked timidly. "We won't let them. I know a shortcut through the trees to Blinky's house," said he. So they hurried away through the trees and reached the house of the witch ahead of the king and his soldiers. Hiding themselves in the shrubbery, they watched the approach of poor Gloria and her escort, all of whom passed so near to them that Pon could have put out a hand and touched his sweetheart had he dared to. Blinky's house had 8 sides, with a door and window in each side. Smoke was coming out of the chimney, and as the guards brought Gloria to one of the doors, it was opened by the old witch in person. She chuckled with evil glee and rubbed her skinny hands together to show the delight with which she greeted her victim, for Blinky was pleased to be able to perform her wicked rites on one so fair and sweet as the princess. Gloria struggled to resist when they bade her enter the house, so the soldiers forced her through the doorway, and even the king gave her a shove as he followed close behind. Pon was so incensed at the cruelty shown Gloria that he forgot all caution and rushed forward to enter the house also. But one of the soldiers prevented him, pushing the gardener's boy away with violence and slamming the door in his face. "Never mind," said Trot soothingly as Pon rose from where he had fallen. "You couldn't do much to help the poor princess if you were inside. How unfortunate it is that you are in love with her." "True," he said sadly. "It is indeed my misfortune. If I did not love her, it would be none of my business what the king did to his niece Gloria. But the unlucky circumstances of my loving her makes it my duty to defend her." "I don't see how you can, duty or no duty," observed Trot. "No, I am powerless, for they are stronger than I. But we might peek in through the window and see what they are doing." Trot was somewhat curious too, so they crept up to one of the windows and looked in, and it so happened that those inside the witch's house were so busy that they did not notice that Pon and Trot were watching them. Gloria had been tied to a stout post in the center of the room, and the king was giving the wicked witch a quantity of money and jewels, which Googly Goo had provided in payment. When this had been done, the king said to her, "Are you perfectly sure you can freeze this maiden's heart so that she will no longer love that low gardener boy?" "Sure as witchcraft, your majesty," the creature replied. "Then get to work," said the king. "There may be some unpleasant features about the ceremony that would annoy me, so I'll bid you good day and leave you to carry out your contract. One word, however. If you fail, I shall burn you at the stake." Then he beckoned to his soldiers to follow him, and throwing wide the door of the house, walked out. This action was so sudden that Captain Cruel almost caught Trot and Pon eavesdropping, but they managed to run away around the house before he saw them. Away he marched up the road, followed by his men, heartlessly leaving Gloria to the mercies of old Blinky. When they again crept up to the window, Trot and Pon saw Blinky gloating over her victim. Although nearly fainting from fear, the proud princess gazed with haughty defiance into the face of the wicked creature, but she was bound so tightly to the post that she could do no more to express her loathing. Pretty soon Blinky went to the kettle that was swinging by a chain over the fire and tossed into it several magical components. The kettle gave 3 flashes, and at every flash another witch appeared in the room. These hags were very ugly, but when one-eyed Blinky whispered her orders to them, they grinned with joy and began dancing around Gloria. First one and then another cast something into the kettle, when to the astonishment of the watchers at the window, all 3 of the old women were instantly transformed into maidens of exquisite beauty, dressed in the daintiest costumes imaginable. Only their eyes could not be disguised, and an evil glare still shone in their depths. But if the eyes were cast down or hidden, one could not help but admire these beautiful creatures, even with the knowledge that they were mere illusions of witchcraft. Trot certainly admired them, for she had never seen anything so dainty and bewitching, but her attention was quickly drawn to their deeds instead of their persons, and then horror replaced admiration. Into the kettle old Blinky poured another mess from a big brass bottle she took from a chest, and this made the kettle begin to bubble and smoke violently. One by one the beautiful witches approached to stir the contents of the kettle and to mutter a magic charm. Their movements were so graceful and rhythmic, and the wicked witch who had called them to her aid watched them with an evil grin upon her wrinkled face. Finally the incantation was complete. The kettle ceased bubbling, and together the witches lifted it from the fire. Then Blinky brought a wooden ladle and filled it with the contents of the kettle. Going with the spoon to Princess Gloria, she cried, "Love no more. Magic art now will freeze your mortal heart." With this she dashed the contents of the ladle full upon Gloria's breast. Trot saw the body of the princess become transparent, so that her beating heart shone vividly. But now the heart turned from a vivid red to gray, and then to white. A layer of frost formed about it, and tiny icicles clung to its surface. Then slowly the body of the girl became visible again, and the heart was hidden from view. Gloria seemed to have fainted, but now she recovered and, opening her beautiful eyes, stared coldly and without emotion at the group of witches confronting her. Blinky and the others knew by that one cold look that their charm had been successful. They burst into a chorus of wild laughter, and the 3 beautiful ones began dancing again, while Blinky unbound the princess and set her free. Trot rubbed her eyes to prove that she was wide awake and seeing clearly, for her astonishment was great when the 3 lovely maidens turned into ugly crooked hags again. leaning on broomsticks and canes. They jeered at Gloria, but the princess regarded them with cold disdain. Being now free, she walked to a door, opened it, and passed out, and the witches let her go. Trot and Pon had been so intent upon the scene that in their eagerness they had pressed quite hard against the window. Just as Gloria went out of the door, the window sash broke loose from its fastenings and fell with a crash into the room. The witchers uttered a chorus of screams, and then, seeing that their magical incantation had been observed, they rushed for the open window with uplifted broomsticks and canes. But Pon was off like the wind, and Trot followed at his heels. Fear lent them strength to run, to leap across ditches, to speed up the hills, and to vault low fences as a deer would. The band of witches had dashed through the window in pursuit, but Blinky was so old, and the others so crooked and awkward, that they soon realized they would be unable to overtake the fugitives. So the three who had been summoned by the wicked witch put their canes or broomsticks between their legs and flew away through the air, quickly disappearing against the blue sky. Blinky, however, was so enraged at Pon and Trot that she hobbled on in the direction they had taken, fully determined to catch them in time, and to punish them terribly for spying upon her witchcraft. When Pon and Trot had run so far away that they were confident they had made good their escape, they sat down near the edge of a forest to get their breath again, for both were panting hard from their exertions. Trot was the first to recover speech, and she said to her companion, "My, wasn't it terrible?" "The most terrible thing I ever saw," Pon agreed. "And they froze Gloria's heart, so now she can't love you anymore." "Well, they froze her heart, to be sure," admitted Pon, "but I'm in hopes I can melt it with my love." "Where do you suppose Gloria is?" asked the girl after a pause. "She left the witch's house just before we did. Perhaps she's gone back to the king's castle," he said. "I'm pretty sure she started off in a different direction," declared Trot. I looked over my shoulder as I ran to see how close the witches were, and I'm sure I saw Gloria walking slowly away towards the north." "Then let us circle around that way," proposed Pon, "and perhaps we shall meet her." Trot agreed to this, and they left the grove and began to circle around towards the north, thus drawing them nearer and nearer to old Blinky's house again. The wicked witch did not suspect this change of direction, so when she came to the grove, she passed through it and continued on. Pon and Trot had reached a place less than half a mile from the witch's house when they saw Gloria walking towards them. The princess moved with great dignity and with no show of haste whatever, holding her head high and looking neither to right nor left. Pon rushed forward, holding out his arms as if to embrace her and calling her sweet names. But Gloria gazed upon him coldly and repelled him with a haughty gesture. At this the poor gardener's boy sank upon his knees and hid his face in his arms, weeping bitter tears. But the princess was not at all moved by his distress. Passing him by, she drew her skirts aside as if unwilling they should touch him, and then she walked up the path a ways and hesitated, as if uncertain where to go next. Trot was grieved by Pon's sobs and indignant because Gloria treated him so badly, but she remembered why. "I guess your heart is frozen all right," she said to the princess. Gloria nodded gravely in reply and then turned her back upon the little girl. "Can't you like even me?" asked Trot, half pleadingly. "No," said Gloria. "Your voice sounds like a refrigerator," sighed the little girl. "I'm awful sorry for you, 'cause you were sweet and nice to me before this happened. You can't help it, of course, but it's a dreadful thing just the same." "My heart is frozen to all mortal loves," announced Gloria calmly. "I do not even love myself." "That's too bad," said Trot, "for if you can't love anybody, you can't expect anybody to love you." "I do," cried Pon. "I shall always love her." "Well, you're just a gardener's boy," replied Trot, "and I didn't think you mounted to much from the first. I can love the old Princess Gloria, with a warm heart and nice manners, but this one gives me the shivers." "It's her icy heart, that's all," said Pon. "That's enough," insisted Trot. "Seeing her heart isn't big enough to skate on, I can't see that she's of any use to anyone. For my part, I'm going to try to find Button Bright and Captain Bill." "I will go with you," declared Pon. It is evident that Gloria no longer loves me, and that her heart is frozen too stiff for me to melt it with my own love. Therefore, I may as well help you to find your friends." As Trot started off, Pawn cast one more imploring look at the princess, who returned it with a chilly stare, so he followed after the little girl. As for the princess, she hesitated a moment and then turned in the same direction the others had taken, but going far more slowly. Soon she heard footsteps pattering behind her, and up came Googly Goo, a little out of breath with running. "Stop, Gloria," he cried. "I have come to take you back to my mansion, where we are to be married." She looked at him wonderingly a moment, then tossed her head disdainfully and walked on, but Googly Goo kept beside her. "What does this mean?" he demanded. "Haven't you discovered that you no longer love that gardener's boy who stood in my way?" "Yes, I have discovered it," she replied. "My heart is frozen to all mortal loves. I cannot love you, or Pawn, or the cruel king my uncle, or even myself. Go your way, Googly Goo, for I will wed no one at all." He stopped in dismay when he heard this, but in another minute he exclaimed angrily, "You must wed me, Princess Gloria, whether you want to or not. I paid to have your heart frozen. I also paid the king to permit our marriage. If you now refuse me, it will mean that I have been robbed of my precious money and jewels." He almost wept with despair, but she laughed a cold, bitter laugh and passed on. Googly Goo caught at her arm as if to restrain her, but she whirled and dealt him a blow that sent him reeling into a ditch beside the path. Here he lay for a long time, half covered by muddy water, dazed with surprise. Finally the old courtier arose, dripping, and climbed from the ditch. The princess was gone, so, muttering threats of vengeance upon her, upon the king, and upon Blinky, old Googly Goo hobbled back to his mansion to have the mud removed from his costly velvet clothes. Trot and Pawn covered many leagues of ground, searching through forests, in fields, and in many of the little villages of Jinxland, but could find no trace of either Captain Bill or Button Bright. Finally they paused beside a cornfield and sat upon a stile to rest. Pawn took some apples from his pocket and gave one to Trot. Then he began eating another for himself, for this was their time for luncheon. When his apple was finished, Pawn tossed the core into the field. "Chuck, chuck," said a strange voice. "What do you mean by hitting me in the eye with an apple core?" Then rose up the form of the Scarecrow, who had hidden himself in the cornfield while he examined Pawn and Trot and decided whether they were worthy to be helped. "Excuse me," said Pawn. "I didn't know you were there." "How did you happen to be there, anyway?" asked Trot. The Scarecrow came forward with awkward steps and stood behind them. "Ah, you were the gardener's boy," he said to Pawn. Then he turned to Trot. "And you were the little girl who came to Jinxland riding on a big bird, and who has had the misfortune to lose her friend, Captain Bill, and her chum, Button Bright." "Why, how did you know all that?" she inquired. "I know a lot of things," replied the Scarecrow, winking at her comically. "My brains are the carefully assorted, double-distilled, high-efficiency sort that the Wizard of Oz makes. He admits himself that my brains are the best he ever manufactured." "I think I've heard of you," said Trot slowly, as she looked at the Scarecrow with much interest. "But you used to live in the land of Oz." "Oh, I do now," he replied cheerfully. "I've just come over the mountains from the Quadling country to see if I can be of any help to you." "Who, me?" asked Pawn. "No, the strangers from the big world. It seems they need looking after." "I'm doing that myself," said Pawn, a little ungraciously. "If you will pardon me for saying so, I don't see how a scarecrow with painted eyes can look after anyone." "If you don't see that, you are more blind than the Scarecrow," asserted Trot. "He's a fairy man, Pawn, and comes from the fairyland of Oz, so he can do most anything. I hope," she added, turning to the Scarecrow, "you can find Captain Bill for me." "I will try anyhow," he promised. "But who is that old woman who is running towards us and shaking her stick at us?" Trot and Pawn turned around and both uttered an exclamation of fear. The next instant they took to their heels and ran fast up the path, for it was old Blinky, the Wicked Witch, who had at last traced them to this place. Her anger was so great that she was determined not to abandon the chase of Pawn and Trot until she had caught and punished them. The Scarecrow understood at once that the old woman meant harm to his new friends, so as she drew near, he stepped before her. His appearance was so sudden and unexpected that Blinky ran into him and toppled him over, but she tripped on his straw body and went rolling in the path beside him. The Scarecrow sat up and said, I beg your pardon, but she whacked him with her stick and knocked him flat again. Then, furious with rage, the old woman sprang upon her victim and began pulling the straw out of his body. The poor Scarecrow was helpless to resist, and in a few moments all that was left was an empty suit of clothes and a heap of straw beside it. Fortunately, Blinky did not harm his head, for it rolled into a little hollow and escaped her notice. Fearing that Pawn and Trot would escape her, she quickly resumed the chase and disappeared over the brow of a hill, following the direction in which she had seen them go. Only a short time elapsed before a gray grasshopper with a wooden leg came hopping along and lit directly upon the upturned face of the Scarecrow's head. "Pardon me, but are you resting yourself upon my nose?" remarked the Scarecrow. "Oh, are you alive?" asked the Grasshopper. "That is a question I have never been able to decide," said the Scarecrow's head. "When my body is properly stuffed, I have animation and can move around as well as any live person. The brains in the head you now occupy are a throne, are of very superior quality, and do a lot of very clever thinking. But whether that is being alive or not, I cannot prove to you, for one who lives is liable to death, while I am only liable to destruction." "Seems to me," said the Grasshopper, rubbing his nose with his front legs, "that in your case it doesn't matter, unless you're destroyed already." "I am not. All I need is restuffing," declared the Scarecrow. "And if Pawn and Trot escape the witch and come back here, I am sure they will do me that favor." "Tell me, are Trot and Pawn around here?" inquired the Grasshopper, its small voice trembling with excitement. The Scarecrow did not answer at once, for both his eyes were staring straight upward at a beautiful face that was slightly bent over his head. It was, indeed, Princess Gloria, who had wandered to this spot, very much surprised when she heard the Scarecrow's head talk, and the tiny gray grasshopper answer it. "This," said the Scarecrow, still staring at her, "must be the princess who loves Pawn, the gardener's boy." "Oh, indeed!" exclaimed the Grasshopper, who of course was Captain Bill, as he examined the young lady curiously. "No," said Gloria frigidly. "I do not love Pawn, or anyone else, for the Wicked Witch has frozen my heart." "What a shame!" cried the Scarecrow. "One so lovely should be able to love. But would you mind, my dear, stuffing that straw into my body again?" The dainty princess glanced at the straw and at the well-worn blue munchkin clothes and shrank back in disdain. But she was spared from refusing the Scarecrow's request by the appearance of Trot and Pawn, who had hidden in some bushes just over the brow of the hill and waited until old Blinky had passed them by. Their hiding place was on the same side as the witch's blind eye, and she rushed on in the chase of the girl and the youth without being aware that they had tricked her. Trot was shocked at the Scarecrow's sad condition, and at once began putting the straw back into his body. Pawn, at the sight of Gloria, again appealed to her to take pity on him, but the frozen-hearted princess turned coldly away, and with a sigh the gardener's boy assisted Trot. Neither of them at first noticed the small grasshopper, which at their appearance had skipped off the Scarecrow's nose and was now clinging to a wisp of grass beside the path, where he was not likely to be stepped upon. Not until the Scarecrow had been neatly restuffed and set upon his feet again, when he bowed to his restorers and expressed his thanks, did the grasshopper move from his perch. Then he leapt lightly onto the path and called out, "Trot, Trot, look at me. I'm Captain Bill. See what the Wicked Witch has done to me." The voice was so small, to be sure, but it reached Trot's ears and startled her greatly. She looked intently at the grasshopper, her eyes wide with fear at first. Then she knelt down and noticed the wooden leg. She began to weep sorrowfully. "Oh, Captain Bill, dear Captain Bill, what a cruel thing to do," she sobbed. "Don't cry, Trot," begged the grasshopper. "It didn't hurt any, and it doesn't hurt now. But it's mighty inconvenient and humiliating, to say the least." "I wish," said the girl indignantly, while trying hard to restrain her tears, "that I was big enough and strong enough to give that horrid witch a good beating. Should I be turned into a toad for doing this to you, Captain Bill?" "Never mind," urged the Scarecrow in a comforting voice. "Such a transformation doesn't last always, and as a general thing there's some way to break the enchantment. I'm sure Glinda could do it in a jiffy." "Who is Glinda?" inquired Captain Bill. Then the Scarecrow told them all about Glinda, not forgetting to mention her beauty and goodness and her wonderful powers of magic. He also explained how the royal sorceress had sent him to Jinxland especially to help the strangers, whom she knew to be in danger because of the wiles of the cruel king and the Wicked Witch. Gloria had drawn near to the group to listen to their talk, and it seemed to interest her in spite of her frigid manner. They knew, of course, that the poor princess could not help being cold and reserved, so they tried not to blame her. "I ought to have come here a little sooner," said the Scarecrow regretfully. "But Glinda sent me as soon as she discovered you were here and were likely to get into trouble. And now that we are all together, except Button-Bright, over whom it is useless to worry, I propose we hold a council of war to decide what is best to be done." That seemed a wise thing to do, so they all sat upon the grass, including Gloria, and the grasshopper perched upon Trot's shoulder and allowed her to stroke him gently with her hand. "In the first place," began the Scarecrow, "this King Cruel is a usurper and has no right to rule that kingdom of Jinxland." "That is true," said Pon eagerly. "My father was king before him, and I—" "You are a gardener's boy," interrupted the Scarecrow. "Your father had no right to rule either, for the rightful king of this land was the father of Princess Gloria, and only she is entitled to sit upon the throne of Jinxland." "Good," exclaimed Trot. "But what'll we do with King Cruel? I suppose he won't give up the throne unless he has to." "No, of course not," said the Scarecrow. "Therefore it will be our duty to make him give up the throne." "How?" asked Trot. "Give me time to think," was the reply. "That's what my brains are for. I don't know whether you people ever think or not, but my brains are the best that the Wizard of Oz ever turned out, and if I give them plenty of time to work, the result usually surprises me." "Take your time, then," suggested Trot. "There's no hurry." "Thank you," said the straw man, and sat perfectly still for half an hour. During this interval, the grasshopper whispered in Trot's ear, to which she was very close, and Trot whispered back to the grasshopper sitting upon her shoulder. Pon cast loving glances at Gloria, who paid not the slightest heed to them. Finally, the Scarecrow laughed aloud. "Brains working?" inquired Trot. "Yes, they seem in fine order today. We will conquer King Cruel and put Gloria upon his throne as Queen of Jinxland." "Fine," cried the little girl, clapping her hands together gleefully. "But how?" "Leave the how to me," said the Scarecrow proudly. "As a conqueror, I'm a wonder. We will, first of all, write a message to send to King Cruel asking him to surrender. If he refuses, then we will make him surrender." "Why ask him when we know he'll refuse?" inquired Pon. "Why, we must be polite, whatever we do," explained the Scarecrow. "It would be very rude to conquer a king without proper notice." They found it difficult to write a message without paper, pen, and ink, none of which was at hand. So it was decided to send Pon as a messenger, with instructions to ask the king, politely, but firmly, to surrender. Pon was not anxious to be the messenger. Indeed, he hinted that it might prove a dangerous mission. But the Scarecrow was now the acknowledged head of the army of conquest, and he would listen to no refusal. So off Pon started for the king's castle, and the others accompanied him as far as his hut, where they had decided to wait for the gardener boy's return. I think it was because Pon had known the Scarecrow such a short time that he lacked confidence in the straw man's wisdom. It was easy to say, "We will conquer King Cruel," but when Pon drew near to the great castle, he began to doubt the ability of a straw-stuffed man, a girl, a grasshopper, and a frozen-hearted princess to do it. As for himself, he had never thought of defying the king before. That was why the gardener's boy was not very bold when he entered the castle and passed through to the enclosed court where the king was just then seated, with his favorite courtiers around him. None prevented Pon's entrance because he was known to be the gardener's boy, but when the king saw him, he began to frown fiercely. He considered Pon to be to blame for all his troubles with Princess Gloria, who, since her heart had been frozen, had escaped to some unknown place instead of returning to the castle to wed Googly Goo, as she had been expected to do. So the king bared his teeth angrily as he demanded, "What have you done with Princess Gloria?" "Nothing, your majesty. I have done nothing at all," answered Pon in a faltering voice. "She does not love me any more and even refuses to speak to me." "Then why are you here, you rascal?" roared the king. Pon looked first one way and then another, but saw no means of escape, so he plucked up courage. "I am here to summon your majesty to surrender." "What?" shouted the king. "Surrender? Surrender to whom?" Pon's heart sank to his boots. "To the Scarecrow," he replied. Some of the courtiers began to titter, but King Cruel was greatly annoyed. He sprang up and began to beat poor Pon with the golden staff he carried. Pawn howled lustily and would have run away had not two of the soldiers held him until his master was exhausted with punishing the boy. Then they let him go, and he left the castle and returned along the road, sobbing at every step because his body was so sore and aching. "Well," said the Scarecrow, "did the king surrender?" "No, but he gave me a good drubbing," sobbed poor Pawn. Trot was very sorry for Pawn, but Gloria did not seem affected in any way by her lover's anguish. The grasshopper leaped to the Scarecrow's shoulder and asked him what he was going to do next. "Conquer," said the reply. "But I will go alone this time, for beatings cannot hurt me at all, nor can lance thrusts, or sword cuts, or arrow pricks." "Why is that?" inquired Trot. "Because I have no nerves such as you meat people possess. Even grasshoppers have nerves, but straw doesn't, so whatever they do, except just one thing, they cannot injure me. Therefore I expect to conquer King Cruel with ease." "What is that one thing you expected?" asked Trot. "They will never think of it, so never mind. And now, if you will kindly excuse me for a time, I'll go over to the castle and do my conquering." "You have no weapons," Pawn reminded him. "True," said the Scarecrow. "But if I carried weapons, I might injure someone, perhaps seriously, and that would make me unhappy. I would just borrow that riding whip that you see in the corner of your hut, if you don't mind. It isn't exactly proper to walk with a riding whip, but I trust you will excuse the inconsistency." Pawn handed him the whip, and the Scarecrow bowed to all the party and left the hut, proceeding leisurely along the way to the king's castle. I must now tell you what had become of Button Bright since he wandered away in the morning and got lost. This small boy, as perhaps you have discovered, was almost as destitute of nerves as the Scarecrow. Nothing ever astonished him much. Nothing ever worried him or made him unhappy. Good fortune or bad fortune he accepted with a quiet smile, never complaining whatever happened. This was one reason why Button Bright was a favorite with all who knew him, and perhaps it was the reason why he so often got into difficulties or found himself lost. Today, as he wandered here and there, over hill and down dale, he missed Trot and Captain Bill, of whom he was fond, but nevertheless he was not unhappy. The birds sang merrily, and the wildflowers were beautiful, and the breeze had a fragrance of new-mown hay. The only bad thing about this country is its king, he reflected, but the country isn't to blame for that. A prairie dog stuck its round head out of a mound of earth and looked at the boy with bright eyes. "Walk around my house, please," it said, "and then you won't harm it or disturb the babies." "All right," answered Button Bright, and took care not to step on the mound. He went on, whistling merrily, until a petulant voice ordered, "Oh, stop it! Please stop that noise. It gets on my nerves." Button Bright saw an old gray owl sitting in the crotch of a tree, and he replied with a laugh, "All right, old fussy," and stopped whistling till he had passed out of the owl's hearing. At noon he came to a farmhouse where an aged couple lived. They gave him a good dinner and treated him kindly, but the man was deaf and the woman was dumb, so they could answer no questions to guide him on the way to Pawn's house. When he left them, he was just as much lost as he had been before. Every grove of trees he saw from a distance he visited, for he remembered that the king's castle was near a grove of trees and Pawn's hut was near the king's castle. But always he met with disappointment. Finally, passing through one of the groves, he came out into the open and found himself face to face with the orc. "Hello," said Button Bright. "Where did you come from?" "From Orkland," was the reply. "I found my own country at last, and it is not far from here either. I would have come back to you sooner to see how you were getting along, had not my family and friends welcomed my return so royally that a great celebration was held in my honor. I couldn't very well leave Orkland again until the excitement was over." "Can you find your way back home again?" asked the boy. "Yes, easily, for now I know exactly where it is." "But where are Trot and Captain Bill?" Button Bright related to the orc their adventures since it had left them in Jinxland, telling of Trot's fear that the king had done something wicked to Captain Bill, and of Pawn's love for Gloria, and how Trot and Button Bright had been turned out of the king's castle. That was all the news the boy had, but it made the orc anxious for the safety of his friends. "We must go to them at once, for they may need us," he said. "I don't know where to go," confessed Button Bright. "I'm lost." "Well, I can take you back to the hut of the gardener boy," promised the orc. For when I fly high in the air, I can look down and easily spy the king's castle. That was how I happened to spy you just entering the grove, so I flew down and waited until you came out. How can you carry me? Asked the boy. You'll have to sit straddle my shoulders and put your arms around my neck. Do you think you can keep from falling off? I'll try, said Button-Bright. So the orc squatted down and the boy took his seat and held on tight. Then the skinny creature's tail began whirling, and up they went, far above all the treetops. After the orc had circled around once or twice, its sharp eyes located the towers of the castle, and away it flew, straight towards the plains. As it hovered in the air, near by the castle, Button-Bright pointed out Pon's hut, so they landed just before it, and Trot came running out to greet them. Gloria was introduced to the orc, who was surprised to find Captain Bill transformed into a grasshopper. How do you like it? Asked the creature. Why, it worries me a good deal, answered the Captain Bill, perched upon Trot's shoulders. I'm always afraid of being stepped on, and I don't like the flavor of grass and can't seem to get used to it. It's my nature to eat grass, you know, but I begin to suspect it's an acquired taste. Can you give molasses? Asked the orc. I guess I'm not that kind of a grasshopper, replied Captain Bill. But I can't say what I might do if I was squeezed, which I hope I won't be. Well, said the orc, it's a great pity, and I'd like to meet that cruel king and his wicked witch and punish them both severely. You're awfully small, Captain Bill, but I think I would recognize you anywhere by your wooden leg. Then the orc and Button-Bright were told all about Gloria's frozen heart and how the Scarecrow had come from the land of Oz to help them. The orc seemed rather disturbed when it learned that the Scarecrow had gone alone to conquer King Cruel. I'm afraid he'll make a fizzle of it, said the skinny creature, and there's no telling what the terrible king might do to the poor Scarecrow, who seems like a very interesting person. So I believe I'll take a hand in this conquest myself. How? Asked Trot. Wait and see, was the reply. But first of all, I must fly home again, back to my own country. So if you'll forgive my leaving you so soon, I'll be off at once. Stand away from my tail, please, so that the wind from it, when it revolves, won't knock you over. They gave the creature plenty of room, and away it went like a flash, and soon disappeared in the sky. I wonder, said Button-Bright, looking solemnly after the orc, whether he'll ever come back again. Of course he will, returned Trot. The orc's a pretty good fellow, and we can depend on him. And mark my words, Button-Bright, whenever our orc does come back, there's one cruel king in Jinxland that'll wish he hadn't. The Scarecrow was not a bit afraid of King Cruel. Indeed, he rather enjoyed the prospect of conquering the evil king and putting Gloria on the throne of Jinxland in his place. So he advanced boldly to the royal castle and demanded admittance. Seeing that he was a stranger, the soldiers allowed him to enter. He made his way straight to the throne room, where at that time His Majesty was sitting. His Majesty was settling the disputes among his subjects. Who are you? Demanded the king. I'm the Scarecrow of Oz, and I command you to surrender yourself, my prisoner. Why should I do that? Inquired the king, much astonished at the straw man's audacity. Because I've decided you are too cruel a king to rule so beautiful a country. You must remember that Jinxland is part of Oz, and therefore you owe allegiance to Ozma of Oz, whose friend and servant I am. Now, when he heard this, King Cruel was much disturbed in mind, for he knew the Scarecrow spoke the truth. But no one had ever come to Jinxland from the land of Oz, and the king did not intend to be put out of his throne if he could help it. Therefore, he gave a harsh, wicked laugh of derision and said, I'm busy now. Stand out of my way, Scarecrow, and I'll talk to you by and by. But the Scarecrow turned to the assembled courtiers and people and called in a loud voice, I hereby declare, in the name of Ozma of Oz, that this man is no longer ruler of Jinxland. From this moment, Princess Gloria is your rightful queen, and I ask all of you to be loyal to her and to obey her commands. The people looked fearfully at the king, whom they all hated in their hearts, but likewise feared. Cruel was now in a terrible rage, and he raised his golden scepter and struck the Scarecrow so heavy a blow that he fell to the floor. But he was up again in an instant, and with Pon's riding whip he switched the king so hard that the wicked monarch roared with pain, as much as with rage, and called on his soldiers to capture the Scarecrow. They tried to do that, and thrust their lances and swords into the straw body, but without doing any damage except to make holes in the Scarecrow's clothes. However, they were many against one, and finally old Googly Goo brought a rope with which he wound around the Scarecrow, binding his legs together and his arms to his side, and after that the fight was over. The king stormed and danced around in a dreadful fury, for he had never been so switched since he was a boy, and perhaps not then. He ordered the Scarecrow thrust into the castle prison, which was no task at all because one man could carry him easily, bound as he was. Even after the prisoner was removed, the king could not control his anger. He tried to figure out some way to be revenged upon the straw man, but could think of nothing that would hurt him. At last, when the terrified people and the frightened courtiers had all slunk away, old Googly Goo approached the king with a malicious grin upon his face. "I'll tell you what to do," he said. "Build a big bonfire and burn the Scarecrow up, and that will be the end of him." The king was so delighted with his suggestion that he hugged old Googly Goo in his joy. "Of course," he cried. "The very thing. Why did I not think of it myself?" So he summoned his soldiers and retainers and bade them prepare a great bonfire in an open space in the castle park. After he sent word to all his people to assemble and witness the destruction of the Scarecrow, who had dared to defy his power. Before long, a vast throng gathered in the park, and the servants had heaped up enough fuel to make a fire that might be seen from miles away, even in the daytime. When all was prepared, the king and his throne brought out for him to sit upon and enjoy the spectacle, and then he sent his soldiers to fetch the Scarecrow. Now, the one thing in all the world that Straw Man really feared was fire. He knew he would burn very easily, and that his ashes wouldn't amount to much aftermath. It wouldn't hurt him to be destroyed in such a manner, but he realized that many people in the land of Oz, and especially Dorothy and the royal Ozma, would feel sad if they learned that their old friend the Scarecrow was no longer in existence. In spite of this, the Straw Man was brave and faced his fiery fate like a hero. When they marched him out before the concourse of people, he turned to the king with great calmness and said, "This wicked deed will cost you your throne, as well as much suffering, for my friends will avenge my destruction." "Your friends are not here, nor will they know what I have done to you when you were gone and cannot tell them," answered the king in a scornful voice. Then he ordered the Scarecrow bound to a stout stake which he had driven into the ground, and the materials for the fire were heaped all around him. When this had been done, the king's brass band struck up a lively tune, and old Googly Goo came forward with a lighted match and set fire to the pile. At once the flames shot up and crept closer and closer to the Scarecrow. The king and all his people were so intent upon this terrible spectacle that none of them noticed how the sky grew suddenly dark. Perhaps they thought that the loud buzzing sound, like the noise of a dozen moving railway trains, came from the blazing fire, that the rush of wind was merely a breeze. But suddenly down swept a flock of orcs, 100 of them at the least, and the powerful currents of air caused by their revolving tails sent the bonfires scattering in every direction, so that no one burning brand ever touched the Scarecrow. But that was not the only effect of this sudden tornado. King Cruel was blown out of his throne and went tumbling head over heels until he landed with a bump against the stone wall of his own castle. And before he could rise, a big orc sat upon him and held him pressed flat to the ground. Old Googly Goo shot up into the air like a rocket and landed on a tree, where he hung by the middle on a high limb, kicking the air with his feet and clawing the air with his hands, and howling for mercy like the coward he was. The people pressed back until they were jammed close together, while all the soldiers were knocked over and sent sprawling to the earth. The excitement was great for a few minutes, and very frightened inhabitant of Jinxland looked with awe and amazement at the great orcs whose descent had served to rescue the Scarecrow and conquer King Cruel at one and the same time. The orc, who was the leader of the band, soon had the Scarecrow free of his bonds. Then he said, "Well, we were just in time to save you, which is better than being a minute too late. You are now the master here, and we are determined to see your orders obeyed." With this, the orc picked up Cruel's golden crown, which had fallen off his head, and placed it upon the head of the Scarecrow, who in his awkward way then shuffled over to the throne and sat down in it. Seeing this, a rousing cheer broke from the crowd of people, who tossed their hats and waved their handkerchiefs and hailed the Scarecrow as their king. The soldiers joined the people in cheering, for now they fully realized that their hated master was conquered, and it would be wise to show their goodwill to the conqueror. Some of them bound Cruel with ropes and dragged him forward, dumping his body on the ground before the Scarecrow's throne. Googly Goo struggled until he finally slid off the limb of the tree and came tumbling to the ground. He then tried to sneak away and escape, but the soldiers seized and bound him beside Cruel. The tables are turned, said the Scarecrow, swelling out his chest until the straw within it cracked pleasantly, for he was highly pleased. But it was you and your people who did it, friend Orc, and from this time you may count me your humble servant. That certainly took a dark twist that I was not expecting. I mean, damn, we almost burned the Scarecrow alive. We are on to chapter 19, The Conquest of the Witch. Now, as soon as the conquest of King Cruel had taken place, one of the orcs had been dispatched to Pon's house with joyful news. At once Gloria and Pon and Trot and Button Bright hastened toward the castle. They were somewhat surprised by the sight that met their eyes, for there was the Scarecrow, crowned king, and all the people kneeling humbly before him. So they likewise bowed low to the new ruler and then stood beside the throne. Captain Bill, as the gray grasshopper, was still perched upon Trot's shoulder, but now he hopped to the shoulder of the Scarecrow and whispered into the painted ear. I thought Gloria was to be the queen of Jinxland. The Scarecrow shook his head. Not yet, he answered. No queen with a frozen heart is fit to rule any country. Then he turned to his new friend, the orc, who was strutting about, very proud of what he'd done, and said, Do you suppose you or your followers could find old Blinky the Winch? Where is she? Asked the orc. Somewhere in Jinxland, I'm sure. Then, said the orc, we shall certainly be able to find her. It will give me great pleasure, declared the Scarecrow. When you have found her, bring her here to me, and I will then decide what to do with her. The orc called his followers together and spoke a few words to them in a low tone. A moment after, they rose into the air, so suddenly that the Scarecrow, who was very light in weight, was thrown quite out of his throne and into the arms of Pon, who replaced him carefully upon his seat. There was an eddy of dust and ashes, too, and the grasshopper only saved himself from being whirled into the crowd of people by jumping into a tree, from where a series of hops soon brought him back to Trot's shoulder again. The orcs were quite out of sight by this time, so the Scarecrow made a speech to the people and presented Gloria to them, whom they knew well already and were fond of. But not all of them knew of her frozen heart. When the Scarecrow related the story of the Wicked Witch's misdeeds, which had been encouraged and paid for by Cruel and Googly Goo, the people were very indignant. Meantime, the 50 orcs had scattered all over Jinxland, which is not a very big country, and their sharp eyes were peering into every valley and grove and gully. Finally, one of them spied a pair of heels sticking out from underneath some bushes, and with a shrill whistle to warn his comrades that the witch was found, the orc flew down and dragged old Blinky from her hiding place. Then 2 or 3 of the orcs seized the clothing of the wicked woman in their strong claws, and lifting her high in the air, where she struggled and screamed to no avail, they flew with her straight to the royal castle and set her down before the throne of the Scarecrow. Katie, hi, how are you? It's good to see you again, friend. How have your streams been? Good, exclaimed the straw man, nodding his stuffed head with satisfaction. Now we can proceed to business. Mistress Witch, I am obliged to request, gently but firmly, that you undo all the wrongs you have done by means of your witchcraft. Pah, cried old Blinky in a scornful voice. I defy you all. By my magic powers I can turn you all into pigs rooting in the mud, and I'll do it if you are not careful. I think you were mistaken about that, said the Scarecrow. Rising from his throne, he walked with wobbling steps to the side of the Wicked Witch. Before I left the land of Oz, Glinda the royal sorceress gave me a box, which I was not to open except in an emergency. But I feel pretty sure that this occasion is an emergency. Don't you, Trot? He asked, turning towards the little girl. I'm glad you've had some good streams. Now, enjoy your soup. Yep, I'm glad to have you here. You can listen to me butcher a story, because I cannot read for shit tonight. Why, we've got to do something, replied Trot seriously. Things seem in an awful muddle here just now, and they'll be worse if we don't stop this witch from doing more harm to the people. That is my idea exactly, said the Scarecrow, and taking a small box from his pocket, he opened the cover and tossed the contents towards Blinky. The old woman shrank back, pale and trembling, as a fine white dust settled all over her. Under its influence, she seemed to the eyes of all observers to shrivel and grow smaller. "Oh dear, oh dear," she wailed, wringing her hands in fear. "Haven't you the antidote, Scarecrow? Didn't the great sorceress give you another box?" "She did," answered the Scarecrow. "Then give it to me, quick," pleaded the witch. "Give it to me, and I'll do anything you ask me to." "You will do what I asked first," declared the Scarecrow firmly. The witch was shriveling and growing smaller every moment. "Be quick, then," she cried. "Tell me what I must do and let me do it, or it will be too late." "You made Trot's friend Captain Bill a grasshopper. I command you to give him back his proper form again," said the Scarecrow. "Where is he? Where's the grasshopper? Quick, quick!" she screamed. Captain Bill, who had been deeply interested in this conversation, gave a great leap from Trot's shoulder and landed on that of the Scarecrow. Blinky saw him alight, and at once she began to make magical passes and to mumble magic incantations. She was in a desperate hurry, knowing that she had no time to waste, and the grasshopper was so suddenly transformed into the old sailor-man, Captain Bill, that it had no opportunity to jump off the Scarecrow's shoulder, so his great weight bore the stuffed Scarecrow to the ground. No harm was done, however, and the straw man got up and brushed the dust from his clothes while Trot delightedly embraced Captain Bill. "The other box, quick, give me the other box," begged Blinky, who had now shrunk to half her former size. "Not yet," said the Scarecrow. "You must first melt Princess Gloria's frozen heart." "I can't. It's an awful job to do that. I can't," asserted the witch in an agony of fear, for still she was growing smaller. "You must," declared the Scarecrow firmly. The witch cast a shrewd look at him and saw that he meant it, so she began dancing around Gloria in a frantic manner. The princess looked coldly on, as if not at all interested in the proceedings, while Blinky tore a handful of hair from her own head and ripped a strip of cloth from the bottom of her gown. Then the witch sank upon her knees, took a purple powder from her black bag, and sprinkled it over the hair and cloth. "I hate to do it. I hate to do it," she wailed, "for there is no more of this magic compound in all the world. But I must sacrifice it to save my own life. A match! Give me a match, quick!" And panting from lack of breath, she gazed imploringly from one to another. Captain Bill was the only one who had a match, but he lost no time in handing it to Blinky, who quickly set fire to the hair and the cloth and the purple powder. At once a purple cloud enveloped Gloria, and this gradually turned to a rosy pink color, brilliant and quite transparent. Through the rosy cloud they could all see the beautiful princess, standing proud and erect. Then her heart became visible, at first frosted with ice, but slowly growing brighter and warmer till all the frost had disappeared, and it was beating as softly and regularly as any other heart. And now the cloud dispersed and disclosed Gloria, her face suffused with joy, smiling tenderly upon the friends who were grouped around her. Poor Pon stepped forward, timidly, fearing a repulse, but with pleading eyes and arms fondly outstretched towards his former sweetheart. And the princess saw him, and her sweet face lightened with a radiant smile. Without an instant's hesitation, she threw herself into Pon's arms, and this reunion of two loving hearts was so affecting that the people turned away and lowered their eyes so as not to mar the sacred joy of the faithful lovers. But Blinky's small voice was shouting to the Scarecrow for help. "The antidote!" she screamed. "Give me the other box, quick!" The Scarecrow looked at the witch with his quaint, painted eyes and saw that she was now no taller than his knee. So he took from his pocket the second box and scattered its contents on Blinky. She ceased to grow any smaller, but she could never regain her former size, and this the wicked old woman knew well. She did not know, however, that the second powder had destroyed all her power to work magic, and seeking to be revenged upon the Scarecrow and his friends, She at once began to mumble a charm so terrible in its effect that it would have destroyed half the population of Jinxland, had it worked. But it did not work at all, to the amazement of old Blinky. And by this time the Scarecrow noticed that the little witch was trying to do, and said to her, "Go home, Blinky, and behave yourself. You are no longer a witch, but an ordinary old woman, and since you are powerless to do more evil, I advise you to try to do some good in the world. Believe me, it is more fun to accomplish a good act than an evil one, as you will discover when once you have tried it." But Blinky was at that moment filled with grief and chagrin at losing her magic powers. She started away towards her home, sobbing and bewailing her fate, and not one who saw her go was at all sorry for her. The next morning the Scarecrow called upon all the courtiers and the people to assemble in the throne room of the castle, where there was room enough for all that were able to attend. They found the straw man seated upon the velvet cushions of the throne, with the king's glittering crown still upon his stuffed head. On one side of the throne, in a lower chair, sat Gloria, looking radiantly beautiful and fresh as a new-blown rose. On the other side sat Pon, the gardener's boy, so dressed in his old smock frock and looking sad and solemn, for Pon could not make himself believe that so splendid a princess would condescend to love him when she had come to her own and was seated upon a throne. Trot and Captain Bill sat at the feet of the Scarecrow and were much interested in the proceedings. Button-Bright had lost himself before breakfast, but came into the throne room before the ceremonies were over. Back of the throne stood a row of the great orcs, with their leader in the center, and the entrance to the palace was guarded by more orcs, who were guarded with wonder and awe. When all were assembled, the Scarecrow stood up and made a speech. He told how Gloria's father, the good King Kind, who had once ruled them and been loved by everyone, had been destroyed by King Fierce, the father of Pon, and how King Fierce had been destroyed by King Cruel. This last king had been a bad ruler, as they knew very well, and the Scarecrow declared that the only one in all Jinxland who had the right to sit upon the throne was Princess Gloria, the daughter of King Kind. But, he added, it is not for me, a stranger, to say who shall rule you. You must decide for yourselves, or you will not be content. So choose now who shall be your future ruler. And they all shouted, the Scarecrow shall rule us. Which proved that the stuffed man had made himself very popular by his conquest of King Cruel, and the people thought that they would like him for their king. But the Scarecrow shook his head so vigorously that it became loose, and Trot had to pin it firmly to his body again. No, said he. I belong in the land of Oz, where I am the humble servant of the lovely girl who rules us all, the royal Ozma. You must choose one of your own inhabitants to rule over Jinxland. Who shall it be? They hesitated for a moment, and some few cried Pon, but many more shouted, Gloria. So the Scarecrow took Gloria's hand and led her to the throne, where he first seated her, and then took the glittering crown off his own head and placed it upon that of the young lady, where it nestled prettily amongst her soft curls. The people cheered and shouted, kneeling before their new queen, but Gloria leaned down and took Pon's hand in both her hands and raised him to the seat beside her. You shall have both a king and a queen to care for you and to protect you, my dear subjects, she said in a sweet voice, while her face glowed with happiness. For Pon was a king's son before he became a gardener's boy, and because I love him, he is to be my royal consort. That pleased them all, especially Pon, who realized that this was the most important moment of his life. Trot and Button-Bright and Captain Bill all congratulated him on winning the beautiful Gloria, but the orc sneezed twice and said that in his opinion the young lady might have done better. Hello, Ribs. Yeah, poo-poo to the witchy. Then the Scarecrow ordered the guards to bring in the wicked Cruel, king no longer, and when he appeared, loaded with chains and dressed in fustian, the people hissed him and drew back as he passed so their garments would not touch him. Cruel was not haughty nor overbearing any more. On the contrary, he seemed very meek and in great fear of the fate his conquerors had in store for him. But Gloria and Pon were too happy to be revengeful, and so they offered to appoint Cruel to the position of gardener's boy at the castle, Pon having resigned to become king. But they said he must promise to perform promise to reform his wicked ways and to do his duty faithfully, and he must change his name from Cruel to Gruel. All this the man eagerly promised to do, and so when Pon retired to a room in the castle to put on princely raiment, the old brown smock he had formerly worn was given to Gruel, who then went out into the gardens to water the roses. The remainder of that famous day, which was long remembered in Jinxland, was given over to feasting and merrymaking. In the evening there was a grand dance in the courtyard, where the brass band played a new piece of music called the Orc Trot, which was dedicated to our glorious Gloria, the Queen. While the Queen and Pon were leading this dance, and all the Jinxland people were having a good time, the strangers were gathered in a group in the park outside the castle. Captain Bill, Trot, Button-Bright, and the Scarecrow were there, and so was their old friend the Orc. But of all the great flock of orcs which had assisted in the conquest, but 3 remained in Jinxland, beside their leader, the others having returned to their own country as soon as Gloria was crowned queen. To the young orc who had accompanied them in their adventures, Captain Bill said, "You've surely been a friend in need, and we're mighty grateful to you for helping us. I might have been a grasshopper yet if it hadn't been for you, and I might remark that being a grasshopper isn't much fun." "If it hadn't been for you, friend Stork," said the Scarecrow, "I fear I could not have conquered King Cruel." "No," agreed Trot. "You'd have been just a heap of ashes by this time." "And I might have been lost yet," added Button-Bright. "Much obliged, Mr. Orc." "Oh, that's all right," replied the Orc. "Friends must stand together, you know, or they wouldn't be friends. But now I must leave you and be off to my own country, where there's going to be a surprise party on my uncle, and I promised to attend it." "Dear me," said the Scarecrow regretfully. "That is very unfortunate." "Why so?" asked the Orc. "I hoped you would consent to carry us over those mountains into the land of Oz. My mission here is now finished, and I want to get back to the Emerald City." "How did you cross the mountain before?" asked the Orc. "I scaled the cliffs by means of a rope and crossed the great gulf on a strand of spiderweb. Of course I can return in the same manner, but it would be a hard journey, and perhaps an impossible one, for Trot and Button-Bright and Captain Bill. So I thought that if you had the time, you and your people would carry us over the mountain and land us all safely on the other side in the land of Oz." The Orc thoughtfully considered the matter for a moment. Then he said, "I mustn't break my promise to be present at the surprise party. But tell me, could you go to Oz tomorrow night?" "No, that is not what the sentence reads. Let me try that again. Could you go to Oz tonight?" "What, now?" exclaimed Trot. "It is a fine moonlight night," said the Orc, "and I found in my experience that there's no time so good as right away. The fact is," he explained, "it's a long journey to Orkland, and I and my cousins here are all rather tired by our day's work. But if you will start now, and be content to allow us to carry you over the mountains and dump you on the other side, just say the word and off we go." Captain Bill and Trot looked at one another questioningly. The little girl was eager to visit the famous fairyland of Oz, and the old sailor had endured much hardships in Jinxland that he would be glad to be out of it. "It's rather impolite of us not to say goodbye to the new king and queen," remarked the Scarecrow. "But I'm sure they're too happy to miss us, and I assure you it will be much easier to fly on the backs of the orcs over those steep mountains than to climb them as I did." "All right, let's go," Trot decided. "But where's Button-Bright?" Just at this important moment, Button-Bright was lost again, and they all scattered in search of him. He had been standing beside them just a few minutes before, but his friends had an excited hunt for him before they finally discovered the boy seated among the members of the band, beating the end of the bass drum with a bone of a turkey leg that he had taken from the table in the banquet room. "Hello, Trot," he said, looking up at the little girl when she found him. "This is the first chance I ever had to pound a drum with a regular drumstick, and I ate all the meat off the bone myself. Come quick, we're going to the land of Oz." "Oh, what's the hurry?" said Button-Bright, but she seized his arm and dragged him away to the park where the others were waiting. Trot climbed upon the back of her old friend, the orc leader, and the others took their seats on the backs of his 3 cousins. As soon as all were placed and clinging to the skinny necks of the creatures, the revolving tails began to whirl, and up rose the 4 monster orcs and sailed away towards the mountains. They were so high in the air that when they passed the crest of the highest peak, it seemed far below them. No sooner were they all well across the barrier than the orcs swooped downward and landed their passengers upon the ground. "Here we are, safe in the land of Oz," cried the Scarecrow joyfully. "Oh, are we?" asked Trot, looking around curiously. She could see the shadows of stately trees and the outlines of rolling hills. Beneath her feet was soft turf, but otherwise the subdued light of the moon disclosed nothing clearly. "Seems like just any other country," was Captain Bill's comment. "But it isn't," the Scarecrow assured him. "You are now within the boundaries of the most glorious fairyland in all the world. This part of it is just a corner of the Quadling country, and the least interesting portion of it. It's not very thickly settled around here, I'll admit, but..." He was interrupted by a sudden whir and a rush of air as the 4 orcs mounted into the sky. "Good night," called the shrill voices of the strange creatures. And although Trot shouted, "Good night," "Thank you for the follow, Gabe Jam 4. I'm glad to have you here." As loudly as she could, the little girl was almost ready to cry because the orcs had not waited to be properly thanked for all their kindness to her and to Captain Bill. But the orcs were gone, and thanks for good deeds do not amount to much except to prove one's politeness. "Well, friends," said the Scarecrow, "we mustn't stay here in the meadows all night, so let us find a pleasant place to sleep. Not that it matters to me in the least, for I never sleep. But I know that meat people like to shut their eyes and lie still during the dark hours." "I am pretty tired," admitted Trot, yawning as she followed the straw man along a tiny path. "So, if you don't find a house handy, Captain Bill and I will sleep under the trees, or even on the soft grass." But a house was not very far off, although when the Scarecrow stumbled upon it, there was no light in it whatever. Captain Bill knocked on the door several times, and there being no response, the Scarecrow boldly lifted the latch and walked in, followed by the others. And no sooner had they entered than a soft light filled the room. Trot couldn't tell where it came from, for no lamp of any sort was visible. But she did not waste much time on this problem, because directly in the center of the room stood a table set for 3, with lots of good food on it and several of the dishes smoking hot. The little girl and Button-Bright both uttered exclamations of pleasure, but they looked in vain for any cook-stove or fireplace, or for any person who might have prepared for them this delicious feast. "It's fairyland," muttered the boy, tossing his cap in a corner and seating himself at the table. "This supper smells almost as good as that turkey leg I had in Jinxland. Please pass the muffins, Captain Bill." Trot thought it was strange that no people but themselves were in the house, but on the wall opposite the door was a gold frame bearing in big letters the word, "Welcome." So she had no further hesitation in eating of the food so mysteriously prepared for them. "But there are only places for 3, she exclaimed. "3 are quite enough," said the Scarecrow. "I never eat, because I am stuffed full already, and I like my nice clean straw better than I do food." Trot and the sailor man were hungry and made a hearty meal, for not since they had left home had they tasted such good food. It was surprising that Button-Bright could eat so soon after his feast in Jinxland, but the boy always ate whenever there was an opportunity. "If I don't eat now," he said, "the next time I'm hungry I'll wish I had." "Really, Captain," remarked Trot when she found a dish of ice cream appear beside her plate, "I believe this is fairyland sure enough." "There's no doubt of it, Trot," he answered gravely. "I've been here before," said Button-Bright, "so I know." After supper they discovered 3 tiny bedrooms adjoining the big living room of the house, and in each room was a comfortable white bed with downy pillows. You may be sure that the tired mortals were not long in bidding the Scarecrow good night and creeping into their beds, where they slept soundly until morning. For the first time since they set eyes on the terrible whirlpool, Trot and Captain Bill were free from anxiety and care. Button-Bright never worried about anything. The Scarecrow, not being able to sleep, looked out the window and tried to count the stars. I suppose many of you readers have read descriptions of the beautiful and magnificent Emerald City of Oz, so I need not describe it here, except to state that never has any city in any fairyland ever equaled this one in stately splendor. It lies almost exactly in the center of the land of Oz, and in the center of the Emerald City rises the wall of glistening emeralds that surround the Palace of Ozma. The palace is almost a city in itself, and is inhabited by many of the ruler's especial friends and those who have won her confidence and favor. As for Ozma herself, there are no words in any dictionary I can find that are fitted to describe this young girl's beauty of mind and person. Merely to see her is to love her for her charming face and manners. To know her is to love her for her tender sympathy, her generous nature, her truth and honor. Born of a long line of fairy queens, Ozma is as nearly perfect as any fairy may be, and she is noted for her wisdom as well as for other qualities. Her happy subjects adore their ruler, with each one considering her a comrade and protector. At the time of which I write, Ozma's best friend and most constant companion was a little Kansas girl named Dorothy, a mortal who had come to the land of Oz in a very curious manner and had been offered a home in Ozma's palace. Furthermore, Dorothy had been made a princess of Oz, and was as much at home in the royal palace as was the gentle ruler. She knew almost every part of the great country and almost all of its numerous inhabitants. Next to Ozma, she was loved better than anyone in all Oz, for Dorothy was simple and sweet, seldom became angry, and had such a friendly, chummy way that she made friends wherever she wandered. It was she who first brought the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodsman and the Cowardly Lion to the Emerald City. Dorothy had also introduced to Ozma the Shaggy Man and the Hungry Tiger, as well as Billina the Yellow Hen, Eureka the Pink Kitten, and many other delightful characters and creatures. Coming as she did from our world, Dorothy was much like many other girls we know, so there were times when she was not so wise as she might have been, and other times when she was obstinate and got herself into trouble. But life in a fairyland had taught the little girl to accept all sorts of surprising things as matters of course, for while Dorothy was no fairy, but just as mortal as we are, she had seen more wonders than most mortals ever do. Another little girl from the outside world also lived in Ozma's palace. This was Betsy Bobbin, whose strange adventures had brought her to the Emerald City, where Ozma had cordially welcomed her. Betsy was a shy little thing, and could never get used to the marvels that surrounded her, but she and Dorothy were firm friends, and thought themselves very fortunate in being together in this delightful country. One day Dorothy and Betsy were visiting Ozma in the girl ruler's private apartment, and among the things that especially interested them was Ozma's magic picture, set in a handsome frame and hung upon the wall of the room. This picture was a magic one because it constantly changed its scenes and showed events and adventures happening in all parts of the world. Thus it was really a moving picture of life, and if the one who stood before it wished to know what any absent person was doing, the picture instantly showed that person with his or her surroundings. The two girls were not wishing to see anyone in particular on this occasion, but merely enjoyed watching the shifting scenes, some of which were exceedingly curious and remarkable. Suddenly Dorothy exclaimed, "Why, there's Button Bright!" And this drew Ozma to look at the picture as well, for she and Dorothy knew the boy well. "Who is Button Bright?" asked Betsy, who had never met him. "Why, he's the little boy who is just getting off the back of that strange flying creature," explained Dorothy. Then she turned to Ozma and asked, "What is that thing, Ozma? A bird? I've never seen anything like it before." "It is an orc," answered Ozma, for they were watching the scene where the orc and the three big birds were first landing their passengers in Jinxland, after the long flight across the desert. "I wonder," added the girl ruler musingly, "why those strangers dare venture into that unfortunate country, which is ruled by a wicked king. That girl and the one-legged man seem to be mortals from the outside world," said Dorothy. "The man isn't one-legged," corrected Betsy. "He has one wooden leg." "It's almost as bad," declared Dorothy, watching Captain Bill stump around. "They are three mortal adventurers," said Ozma, "and they seem worthy and honest. But I fear they will be treated badly in Jinxland, and if they meet with any misfortune there, it will reflect upon me, for Jinxland is a part of my dominions." "Can't we help them in any way?" inquired Dorothy. "That seems like a nice little girl. I'd be sorry if anything happened to her." Let us watch the picture for a while, suggested Ozma. And so they all drew chairs around the magic picture and followed the adventures of Trot and Captain Bill and Button Bright. Presently the scene shifted and showed their friend the Scarecrow crossing the mountains into Jinxland, and that somewhat relieved Ozma's anxiety, for she knew at once that Glinda the Good had sent the Scarecrow to protect the strangers. The adventures in Jinxland proved very interesting to the three girls in Ozma's palace, who during the succeeding days spent much of their time in watching the picture. It was like a story to them. "That girl's a regular trump," exclaimed Dorothy, referring to Trot, and Ozma answered, "She's a dear little thing, and I'm sure nothing very bad will happen to her. The old sailor is a fine character, too, for he's never once grumbled over being a grasshopper, as so many would have done." When the Scarecrow was nearly burned up, the girls all shivered a little, and they clapped their hands in joy when the flock of orcs came and saved him. So it was that when all the exciting adventures in Jinxland were over, and the four orcs had begun their flight across the mountains to carry the mortals into the land of Oz, Ozma called the wizard to her and asked him to prepare a place for the strangers to sleep. The famous Wizard of Oz was a quaint little man who inhabited the royal palace and attended to all the magical things that Ozma wanted done. He was not as powerful as Glinda, to be sure, but he could do a great many wonderful things. He proved this by placing a house in the uninhabited part of the Quadling country, where the orcs landed Captain Bill and Trot and Button Bright, and fitted it with all the comforts I have described in the last chapter. The next morning Dorothy said to Ozma, "Oughtn't we to go meet the strangers so we can show them the way to the Emerald City? I'm sure that little girl will feel shy in this beautiful land, and I know if it was me I'd like somebody to give me a welcome." Ozma smiled at her little friend and answered, "You and Betsy may go to meet them if you wish, but I cannot leave my palace just now, as I am to have a conference with Jack Pumpkinhead and Professor Wogglebug on important matters. You may take the Sawhorse and the Red Wagon, and if you start soon you may be able to meet the Scarecrow and the strangers at Glinda's palace." "Oh, thank you," cried Dorothy, and went away to tell Betsy to make preparations for the journey. Glinda's castle was a long way from the mountains, but the Scarecrow began the journey cheerfully, since this was of no great importance in the land of Oz, and he had recently made the trip and knew the way. It never mattered much to Button Bright where he was or what he was doing. The boy was content in being alive and having good companions to share his wanderings. As for Trot and Captain Bill, they now found themselves so comfortable and free from danger in this fine fairyland, and they were so awed and amazed by the adventures they were encountering, that the journey to Glinda's castle was more like a pleasure trip than a hardship. So many wonderful things were there to see. Oh, thank you, Katie. It's very sweet of you to say. Button Bright had been in Oz before, but never in this part of it, so the Scarecrow was the only one who knew the paths and could lead them. They had eaten a hearty breakfast, which they found already prepared for them and waiting on the table when they arose from their refreshing sleep, so they left the magic house in a contented mood and with hearts lighter and more happy than they had known for many a day. As they marched along through the fields, the sun shone brightly and the breeze was laden with delicious fragrance, for it carried with it the breath of millions of wildflowers. At noon, when they stopped to rest by the banks of a pretty river, Trot said with a long-drawn breath that was much like a sigh, I wish we'd brought with us some of the food that was left from our breakfast, for I'm getting hungry again." Scarcely had she spoken when a table rose up before them, as if from the ground itself, and it was loaded with fruits and nuts and cakes and many other good things to eat. The little girl's eyes opened wide at this display of magic, and Captain Bill was not sure that the things were actually there and fit to eat until he had taken them in his hand and tasted them. But the Scarecrow said with a laugh, "Someone is looking after your welfare, that is certain, and from the looks of this table I suspect my friend the wizard has taken us in his charge. I've known him to do things like this before, and if we are in the wizard's care you need not worry about your future." "Who's worrying?" inquired Button Bright, already at the table and busily eating. The Scarecrow looked around the place while the others were feasting, and finding many things unfamiliar to him, he shook his head and remarked, "I must have taken the wrong path back in that last valley, For on my way to Jinxland, I remember that I passed around the foot of this river, where there was a great waterfall. Did the river make a bend after the waterfall? Asked Captain Bill. No, the river disappeared. Only a pool of whirling water showed what had become of the river. But I suppose it is underground somewhere, and will come to the surface again in another part of the country. Well, suggested Trot as she finished her luncheon, as there is no way to cross this river, I suppose we'll have to find that waterfall and go around it. Exactly, replied the Scarecrow. So they soon renewed their journey, following the river for a long time until the roar of the waterfall surrounded in their ears. By and by they came to the waterfall itself, a sheet of silver dropping far, far down into a tiny lake which seemed to have no outlet. From the top of the fall, where they stood, the banks gradually sloped away, so that the descent by land was quite easy, while the river could do nothing but glide over an edge of a rock and tumble straight down to the depths below. You see, said the Scarecrow, leaning over the brink, this is called by our Oz people the Great Waterfall, because it is certainly the highest one in all the land. But I think... Help! He had lost his balance and pitched headforemost into the river. They saw a flash of straw and blue clothes, and the painted face looked upward in surprise. The next moment the Scarecrow was swept over the waterfall and plunged into the basin below. The accident had happened so suddenly that for a moment they were all too horrified to speak or move. Quick, we must go help him or he will drown, Trot exclaimed. Even while speaking, she began to descend the bank to the pool below, and Captain Bill followed him as swiftly as his wooden leg would let him. Button-Bright came slowly, calling to the girl. But he can't drown, Trot. He's a Scarecrow. But she wasn't sure a Scarecrow couldn't drown, and never relaxed her speed until she stood on the edge of the pool with spray splashing in her face. Captain Bill puffed and panted, had just enough voice to ask as he reached her side, See him, Trot? Not a speck of him. Oh, Captain, what do you suppose has become of him? I suppose, replied the sailor, that he's in that water, more or less far down, and I'm afraid it'll make his straw pretty soggy. But as for his being drowned, I agree with Button-Bright that it can't be done. There was small comfort in this assurance, and Trot stood for some time searching with her eyes the bubbling water in the hopes that the Scarecrow would finally come to the surface. Thank you for the follow, Dumbsmoke TV. Welcome to our group. Glad to have you here with us. Presently she heard Button-Bright calling, Come here, Trot, and looking around she saw that the boy had crept over the wet rocks to the edge of the waterfall and seemed to be peering behind it. Making her way towards him, she asked, What can you see? A cave, he answered. Let's go in. Perhaps we'll find the Scarecrow there. She was a little doubtful of that, but the cave interested her, and so did it Captain Bill. There was just enough space at the edge of the sheet of water for them to crowd in behind it, but after that dangerous entrance they found room enough to walk upright, and after a time they came to an opening in the wall of rock. Approaching this opening, they gazed within it and found a series of steps, cut so that they might easily descend into the cavern. Trot turned to look inquiringly at her companions. The falling water made such din and roaring that her voice could not be heard. Captain Bill nodded his head, but before he could enter the cave, Button-Bright was before him, clambering down the steps without a particle of fear, so the others followed the boy. The first steps were wet with spray and slippery, but the remainder were quite dry. A rosy light seemed to come from the interior of the cave, and this lighted their way. After the steps, there was a short tunnel, high enough for them to walk erect in, and then they reached the cave itself and paused in wonder and admiration. They stood on the edge of a vast cavern, the walls and domed roof of which were lined with countless rubies, exquisitely cut and flashing sparkling rays from one to another. This caused a radiant light that permitted the entire cavern to be distinctly seen, and the effect was so marvelous that Trot drew in her breath with a sort of gasp and stood quite still in wonder. But the walls and roof of the cavern were merely a setting for a more wonderful scene. In the center was a bubbling cauldron of water, for here the river rose again, splashing and dashing till its spray rose high in the air, where it took the ruby color of the jewels and seemed like a seething mass of flame. And while they gazed into the tumbling, tossing water, the body of the Scarecrow suddenly rose in the center, struggling and kicking, and the next instant wholly disappeared from view. My, but he's wet, exclaimed Button-Bright, but none of the others heard him. Trot and Captain Bill discovered that a broad ledge, covered like the walls with glittering rubies, ran all around the cavern, so they followed this gorgeous path to the rear and found where the water made its final dive underground, before it disappeared entirely. Where it plunged into this dim abyss, the river was black and dreary-looking, and they stood gazing in awe until just beside them the body of the Scarecrow again popped up from the water. The straw man's appearance on the water was so sudden that it startled Trot, but Captain Bill had the presence of mind to stick his wooden leg out over the water, and the Scarecrow made a desperate clutch and grabbed the leg with both hands. He managed to hold on until Trot and Button-Bright knelt down and seized his clothing, but the children would have been powerless to drag the soaked Scarecrow ashore had not Captain Bill now assisted them. When they laid him on the ledge of rubies, he was the most useless-looking Scarecrow you can imagine. His straw, sodden and dripping with water, his clothing wet and crumpled, while even the sack upon which his face was painted had become so wrinkled that the old jolly expression of their stuffed friend's features was entirely gone. But he could still speak, and when Trot bent down her ear so she could hear him say, "Get me out of here as soon as you can," that seemed a wise thing to do, so Captain Bill lifted his head and shoulders, and Trot and Button-Bright each took a leg. Among them they partly carried and partly dragged the damp Scarecrow out of the ruby cavern, along the tunnel, and up the flight of rock steps. It was somewhat difficult to get him past the edge of the waterfall, but they succeeded, after much effort, and a few minutes later laid the poor comrade on a grassy bank where the sun shone upon him freely, and he was beyond the reach of the spray. Captain Bill now knelt down and examined the straw that the Scarecrow was stuffed with. "I don't believe it'll be of much use to him any more," he said. "It's full of pollywogs and fish eggs, and the water has took all the crinkle out of the straw, and ruined it. I guess, Trot, that the best thing for us to do is empty out all his body and carry his head and clothes along the road till we come to a field or a house where we can get some fresh straw." "Yes, Captain," she agreed. "There's nothing else to be done. But how shall we ever find the road to Glinda's palace without the Scarecrow to guide us?" "That's easy," said the Scarecrow, speaking in a rather feeble but distinct voice. "If Captain Bill will carry my head on his shoulders, eyes front, I can tell him which way to go." So they followed that plan and emptied all the old wet straw out of the Scarecrow's body. Then the sailor man wrung out the clothes and laid them in the sun till they were quite dry. Trot took charge of the head and pressed the wrinkles out of the face as it dried, so that after a while the Scarecrow's expression became natural again and as jolly as before. This work consumed some time, but when it was completed they again started upon their journey. Button-Bright carrying the boots and hat, Trot the bundle of clothes, and Captain Bill the head. The Scarecrow, having regained his composure and being now in good humor, despite his recent mishaps, beguiled their way with stories of the Land of Oz. It was not until the next morning, however, that they found straw with which to restuff the Scarecrow. That evening they came to the same little house they had slept in before, only now it was magically transferred to a new place. The same bountiful supper as before was found smoking hot upon the table, and the same cozy beds were ready for them to sleep in. They rose early, and after breakfast went out of the doors, and there, lying just beside the house, was a heap of clean, crisp straw. Ozma had noticed the Scarecrow's accident in her magic pitcher, and had notified the wizard to provide the straw, for she knew the adventurers were not likely to find straw in the country through which they were now traveling. They lost no time in stuffing the Scarecrow anew, and he was greatly delighted at being able to walk around again and to assume the leadership of the little party. "Really," said Trot, "I think you're better than you were before, for now you are fresh and sweet all through and wrestle beautifully when you move." "Thank you, my dear," he replied gratefully. "I always feel more like a new man when I'm freshly stuffed. No one likes to get musty, you know, and even good straw may be spoiled by age." "It was water that spoiled you the last time," remarked Button-Bright, "which proves that too much bathing is as bad as too little. But after all, Scarecrow, water is not as dangerous for you as fire." "All things are good in moderation," declared the Scarecrow. "But now let us hurry on, for we should not reach Glinda's palace by nightfall." At about 4 o'clock of that same day, the red wagon drew up at the entrance of Glinda's palace, and Dorothy and Betsy jumped out. Ozma's red wagon was almost a chariot, being inlaid with rubies and pearls, and it was drawn by Ozma's favorite steed, the wooden sawhorse. "Shall I unharness you?" asked Dorothy, "so you can come in and visit?" "No," replied the Sawhorse. "I'll just stand here and think. Take your time. Thinking doesn't seem to bore me at all." "What will you think of?" inquired Betsy. "Of the acorn that grew the tree from which I was made." So they left the wooden animal and went in to see Glinda, who welcomed the little girls in her most cordial manner. "I knew you were on your way," said the good sorceress, when they were seated in her library, "for I learned from my record book that you intended to meet Trot and Button-Bright on their arrival here." "Is the strange little girl named Trot?" asked Dorothy. "Yes, and her companion, the old sailor, is named Captain Bill. I think we shall like them very much, for they are just the kind of people to enjoy and appreciate our fairyland, and I do not see any way at present for them to return again to the outside world." "Well, there's room enough here for them, I'm sure," said Dorothy. "Betsy and I are already eager to welcome Trot. It will keep us busy for a year at least, showing her all the wonderful things in Oz." Glinda smiled. "I have lived here many years," said she, "and I have not seen all the wonders of Oz yet." Meantime, the travelers were drawing near to the palace, and when they first caught sight of its towers, Trot realized that it was far more grand and imposing than was the king's castle in Jinxland. The nearer they came, the more beautiful the palace appeared, and when finally the Scarecrow led them up the great marble steps, even Button-Bright was filled with awe. I don't see any soldiers to guard the place," said the little girl. "There is no need to guard Glinda's palace," replied the Scarecrow. "We have no wicked people in Oz, that we know of, and even if there were any, Glinda's magic will be powerful enough to protect her." Button-Bright was now standing on the top steps of the entrance, and he suddenly exclaimed, "Why, there's the Sawhorse and the red wagon! Hip, hip, hooray!" And the next moment he was rushing down to throw his arms around the neck of the wooden horse, which good-naturedly permitted this familiarity when it recognized in the boy an old friend. Button-Bright's shout had been heard inside the palace, so now Dorothy and Betsy came running out to embrace their beloved friend, the Scarecrow, and to welcome Trot and Captain Bill to the land of Oz. "We've been watching you for a long time in Ozma's magic picture," said Dorothy, "and Ozma has sent us to invite you to her own palace in the Emerald City. I don't know if you realize how lucky you are to get that invitation, but you'll understand it better after you've seen the royal palace in the Emerald City." Glinda now appeared in person to lead all the party into her azure reception room. Trot was a little afraid of the stately sorceress, but gained courage by holding fast to the hands of Betsy and Dorothy. Captain Bill had no one to help him feel at ease, so the old sailor sat stiffly on the edge of his chair and said, "Yes, ma'am," or "No, ma'am," when he was spoken to, and was greatly embarrassed by so much splendor. The Scarecrow had lived so much in palaces that he felt quite at home, and he chatted to Glinda and the Oz girls in a merry, light-hearted way. He told all about his adventures in Jinxland, and at the Great Waterfall, and on the journey hither, most of which our hearers know already, and then he asked Dorothy and Betsy what had happened in the Emerald City since he had left there. They all passed the evening and the night at Glinda's palace, and the sorceress was so gracious to Captain Bill that the old man by degrees regained his self-possession and began to enjoy himself. Trot had already come to the conclusion that in Dorothy and Betsy she had found two delightful comrades, and Button-Bright was just as much at home here as he had been in the fields of Jinxland or when he was buried in the popcorn snow of the land of Mo. The next morning they rose bright and early, and after breakfast bade goodbye to the kind sorceress, whom Trot and Captain Bill thanked earnestly for sending the Scarecrow to Jinxland to rescue them. Then they all climbed into the red wagon. There was room for all on the board seats, and when all had taken their places, Dorothy, Trot, and Betsy on the rear seat, and Captain Bill, Button-Bright, and the Scarecrow in front, they called, "Giddy up!" to the Sawhorse, and the wooden steed moved briskly away, pulling the red wagon with ease. It was now that the strangers began to perceive the real beauties of the land of Oz, for they were passing through a more thickly settled part of the country, and the population grew more dense as they drew nearer to the Emerald City. Everyone they met had a cheery word or a smile for the Scarecrow, Dorothy, and Betsy Bobbin, and some of them remembered Button-Bright and welcomed him back to their country. It was a happy party indeed that journeyed in the red wagon to the Emerald City, and Trot already began to hope that Ozma would permit her and Captain Bill to live always in the land of Oz. When they reached the great city, they were more amazed than ever, both by the concourse of people in their quaint and picturesque costumes, and by the splendor of the city itself. But the magnificence of the royal palace quite took their breath away, until Ozma received them in her own pretty apartment, and by her charming manners and assuring smiles made them feel they were no longer strangers. Trot was given a lovely room next to that of Dorothy, while Captain Bill had the coziest sort of a room next to Trot's and overlooking the gardens. And that evening Ozma gave a grand banquet and reception in honor of the new arrivals. While Trot had read of many of the people she had met, Captain Bill was less familiar with them, and many of the unusual characters introduced to him that evening caused the old sailor to open his eyes wide in astonishment. He had thought the live Scarecrow about as curious as anyone could be, but now he met the Tin Woodsman, who was all made of tin, even to his heart, and carried a gleaming axe over his shoulder wherever he went. Then there was Jack Pumpkinhead, whose head was a real pumpkin with the face carved upon it, and Professor Wogglebog, who had the shape of an enormous bug but was dressed in neat-fitting garments. The professor was an interesting talker and had very polite manners, but his face was so comical that it made Captain Bill smile to look at it. A great friend of Dorothy and Ozma seemed to be a machine man called Tick-Tock, who ran down several times during the evening and had to be wound up again by someone before he could move or speak. At the reception appeared the Shaggy Man and his brother, both very popular in Oz, as well as Dorothy's Uncle Henry and Aunt Em, two happy old people who lived in a pretty cottage near the palace. But what perhaps seemed most surprising to both Trot and Captain Bill was the number of peculiar animals admitted into Ozma's parlors, where they not only conducted themselves quite properly, but were able to talk as well as anyone. There was the Cowardly Lion, an immense beast with a beautiful mane, and the Hungry Tiger, who smiled continually, and Eureka the Pink Kitten, who lay curled upon a cushion and had a rather supercilious manners, and the Wooden Sawhorse, and 9 tiny piglets that belonged to the Wizard, and a mule named Hank, who belonged to Betsy Bobbin. A fuzzy little terrier dog named Toto laid at Dorothy's feet but seldom took part in the conversation, although he listened to every word that was said. But the most wonderful of all to Trot was a square beast with a winning smile that squatted in a corner of the room and wagged his square head at everyone in quite a jolly way. Betsy told Trot that this unique beast was called the Woozy, and there was no other like him in all the world. Captain Bill and Trot had both looked around expectantly for the Wizard of Oz, but the evening was far advanced before the famous little man entered the room. But he went up to the strangers at once and said, "I know you, but you don't know me, so let's get acquainted." And they did get acquainted in a very short time, and before the evening was over, Trot felt that she knew every person and animal present at the reception, and that they were all her good friends. Suddenly they looked around for Button-Bright, but he was nowhere to be found. "Dear me," cried Trot, "he's lost again." "Never mind, my dear," said Ozma, with her charming smile. "No one can go far astray in the land of Oz, and if Button-Bright isn't lost occasionally, he isn't happy." And that, my friends, is the end of The Scarecrow of Oz. That was definitely a interesting story. I really enjoyed it. I hope that you all enjoyed it as well. I will have to figure out the next Oz story that I will read for us. I might put up a poll in the Discord and you guys can choose. Because, like I said, I don't even know what order the stories were written in. I don't think it really matters. You can hear my AC now. I don't think my AC is running now. I'm not sure. Oh, I'm glad that you enjoyed listening, Katie. Here is a link to the Discord if any of you want to join it. How many are there? There are 14 books total in the Wizard of Oz world that were written by L. Frank Baum. And we have read The Wizard of Oz, The Patchwork Girl of Oz, Ozma of Oz. I don't know if we read Ozma of Oz or not. I know we read the Scarecrow. Well, this was the Scarecrow of Oz, so we read that obviously. We read the Patchwork Girl of Oz, and we read the Wizard of Oz. I think I read the Ozma of Oz. So we've still got 10 more to go through. So that'll take me like most of the year probably. And I've also got a book of French fairy tales that I read from one night, and those were fun. The Tin Man of Oz? Okay. Let's see if I have that one. I'm sure I do. Let's see. Let's see if we have the Tin Man of Oz. Okay, I don't want an audiobook. That doesn't help me. But yeah, I will find the Tin Man of Oz by the next stream. We'll read that. And if I don't, I will go back to my French fairy tales. And I've also got classics of children's literature, which is probably more suited to my reading level. That was a joke. But yeah, we will do some more reading next time. One of the Oz books for sure. There's definitely a lot of them. And I'll also try to find us a movie to watch. I'm going to be on vacation for the next week, and it is much too hot to do anything else. So I am probably going to be reading a lot and streaming a lot more. So again, thank you all for joining. I had a fun stream. I hope you enjoyed listening. I know it's better if I could probably read the whole story through in one sitting. Let me see who is on that we can go and visit. Who is live? We've got Anna doing sand art. If you could send the cool, I would be very grateful, but I know it's not possible. The weather is just so messed up. But yeah, I definitely plan on doing a lot of streaming because I don't intend on venturing out of my air-conditioned house any more than I absolutely have to. So do you guys want to go see Anna Sand Experiment? She does sand art with a light box, and that's really cool. Or we can go visit the pigeons. Not a lot of people streaming tonight. So I think I am going to send you off to see Anna do sand art, because that is another good way to... Come on, where are you? That's another good way to sort of end the day or begin the day. Yeah, Anna's great. Sand art is awesome. So go say hi to Anna. Show her lots of love, because she is an amazing person. And I will see you all again next time. And again, if you want to join the Discord, we'll be talking over there, because I'm hoping that sometime on stream we can do an RPG Maker game and like create it all ourselves on stream. Not in one stream, because that would be impossible, and it takes me a while to even get it all put together, but I want to do a lot of other things besides just reading. Not that I don't love reading, because I do. So anyway, have a great night or day. Stay comfortable, stay cozy, and we are off to visit Anna. And why is the raid button not working? What? I'm so confused. Okay, the raid button isn't wanting to work. So let's cancel the raid. No, what are you doing? Oh my god, I hate you. Oh yes. I hate you. Okay. And it's... Why? Why? I just want to... I can see there's an error. There we go.